All right, let's dive into Paddington in Peru. This new adventure, I'm really curious to see how it stacks up against, the rest of the franchise, especially Paddington 2. That one was really something special.
Oh, for sure.
We're going to be looking at it through the lens of Cinema Bites, the movie podcast.
Yeah, they have a good feel for these kinds of heartwarming family films. What makes them tick? Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the first things that jumps out from Cinema Bites take Ben Whishaw. His voice acting is incredible. They even went so far as to say one of the best in movie history, which is a bold claim.
Yeah, that's a big statement, but I can see why they'd say that. I mean, think about how Wishaw captures that optimism of Paddington, right? Like, even when things get a bit rough for him in this film, Cinema Bites was talking about how there's this, like, enduring hopefulness that just shines through. It really connects with people.
Yeah, it's like he's maturing but not losing that innocence.
Exactly.
Not just a bear who loves marmalade, right? There's some real depth there.
Yeah.
And speaking of memorable performances, Cinema Bites could not stop raving about Olivia Colman as the Reverend Mother. They even compared her to, and I quote, a singing serial killer.
Wow. I have to admit, that description piqued my interest. Sounds like she brings a lot of that classic Paddington humor to the film.
Oh, absolutely, that comedic energy. And of course, we can't forget Antonio Banderas, right? As our treasure hunter, Captain Cabot, Cinema Bites loved his performance. And get this, he also plays all of Cabot's ghostly ancestors.
Oh, wow. So he's really got a multi-generational role going on there.
Yeah, exactly. So visually, Cinema Bites talked about the Peruvian jungle setting and the El Dorado-inspired sets, and they just raved about how stunning they are. But it's not just about the visuals themselves, right? Cinema Bites was saying that it ties into kind of those core Paddington themes about identity and belonging.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting direction to take it in. I mean, we've seen him navigate those themes in London. But what happens when he's back in, like, a completely new environment? Trying to connect with his roots, maybe.
Right. Does Paddington in Peru bring a fresh perspective on those ideas?
It does. It seems to pose the question, is home where you're born or where you're loved? Cinema Bites pointed that out. And I think it's something the film really tries to explore.
That's a deep question for sure. And Cinema Bites also mentioned, kind of a tear-jerking finale. Do you think this film leans more into that emotional side?
It sounds like it. I think they were pointing out that the film uses emotional payoff to reinforce the power of kindness, which is, in my opinion, crucial for a family film. It's not just about entertainment, right? It's about leaving the audience with that sense of warmth.
I'm a sucker for a heartwarming story that makes me cry, as long as there's a good message behind it. But, Paddington 2, it really set a high bar. I'm curious, what did Cinema Bites think about this sequel in comparison? Did they think it lived up to the hype?
They did bring up what they call the, quote, Paddington 2 problem. It's tough to follow a film that was so universally loved, so critically acclaimed. And I think they felt that while Paddington in Peru has a lot going for it, it might not quite reach those same heights. They specifically mentioned the director change, Dougal Wilson taking over for Paul King, and how, while Wilson's talented, he might not have the same, well, they called it campy verve that King brought to the first two films.
Yeah, it's hard to capture that lightning in a bottle twice, right? It makes you wonder, what other key differences did they highlight?
One thing they mentioned that I think will be interesting for a lot of fans is that the Brown children, Judy and Jonathan, don't seem to have as prominent a role in this film. They said that, quote, the Brown children barely speak in the film. So it makes you wonder how that impacts the dynamic, because they're such a big part of Paddington's world.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions. Why are they sidelined? How does that change things? It'll be interesting to see how the film handles that.
Absolutely. Another thing that Cinema Bites pointed out was that Paddington in Peru has a lot more action than the previous films. They said it might come at the cost of some of that whimsical charm we associate with the franchise.
That is interesting. Do you think that's a response to broader trends in family films? This shift toward, bigger, more action-packed sequences? Is it a good thing, a bad thing? Food for thought as we continue exploring this review.
Oh, definitely. I'm curious to hear your take on that too, as a fan of the series. How do you feel about that potential shift?
Before we get into that, I think the big question on everyone's mind is it actually worth watching? So we'll find out Cinema Bites' final verdict and break down what it all means. But first, a quick break.
And we're back. So we've talked about what Cinema Bites loved about Paddington in Peru, the good stuff, but they also pointed out a few things that might give fans pause. The whole, the Paddington 2 problem. How do you follow up a movie that was just so good? Right? Like, is it riding on the coattails of that success? Cinema Bites seemed to think so, at least when it came to the humor. Like, some of the jokes felt a bit predictable, maybe relying a little too much on those familiar Paddington tropes instead of, breaking new ground.
Yeah, it's tough. You want to stay true to the heart of the character, but you also don't want to just rehash the same old gags.
Exactly, finding that balance. And it's interesting because they also mentioned the pacing. Apparently, the first two acts are a little slow. It takes a while for things to really get going.
So maybe the story takes a while to unfold. Did they say anything about, like, what contributes to that slower pace?
Yeah, it sounds like the storyline in this one is a bit more complex. There's a whole thing about searching for a lost city and digging into Paddington's family history.
Oh, so more backstory. I wonder if that adds depth to his character or if it feels forced. What did Cinema Bites think about that?
They seemed pretty intrigued by it, actually. They said it adds a layer of emotional complexity to Paddington's journey. You know, he's not just a cute bear with a love for Marmalade. He's a bear on a quest for self-discovery, grappling with those big questions of, like, who am I? Where do I belong?
It's like that question they brought up earlier, is home where you're born or where you're loved? It seems like Paddington in Peru really digs into that.
It does. But yeah, going back to the pacing, did they talk about if it, like, picks up at all?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Does it find its rhythm eventually?
Well, they said the third act is where all the action kicks in. Big chase scene through the jungle, the final showdown with the treasure hunters, all that good stuff.
Okay, so maybe that's where the coasting on goodwill comes in, right? Like, is the film relying on those big, splashy action sequences to make up for a slower start?
It's possible. And they did point out that, the action, while it's well done, it might lack some of that whimsical charm that we saw in the previous films. Like, it felt a bit more, I guess, Hollywood, like they were trying to amp up the spectacle, which, not all fans might be on board with.
Yeah, it's a bit of a departure from that quieter, more character-driven humor that we associate with Paddington. It makes you wonder, is this a deliberate choice to try to appeal to a wider audience?
Maybe. Perhaps they're hoping to bring in people who aren't as familiar with, like, British humor or that gentler style of storytelling.
That's an interesting thought. But what about those of us who, fell in love with Paddington for his kindness, his gentle spirit? Will we still connect with this more action-heavy version?
Cinema Bites seem to think so. They stress that even with all the action, the heart of the film is still there. Paddington's core values, kindness, optimism, love for his family, all of that, it still shines through.
That's good to hear. So it sounds like Paddington in Peru is trying to do a lot, balance the classic elements with a bigger scope, a little bit of Hollywood flair. It's a risky move, for sure.
Yeah, and the big question is, does it pay off? I mean, Cinema Bites gave it a 7.5 out of 10. Respectable, but not quite the home run that Paddington 2 was.
So not bad, but maybe some room for improvement. Well, I guess the only way to know for sure is to see it for ourselves.
Right, exactly. We can talk about it all day, but ultimately it's up to each individual viewer to decide, is Paddington in Peru a worthy successor?
Yeah, and before you rush out to buy those tickets, we want to ask you a question, something a little more personal. We've talked about those themes of home and belonging, but what about you? What kind of adventure would you send Paddington on? So we've heard what the critics think, but now I want to hear from you. What kind of adventure would you cook up for Paddington?
Ooh, that's a fun thought. Maybe send him on a whirlwind tour of Europe. Picture him trying to navigate the crowded streets of Rome, or maybe getting lost in a charming little village in the French countryside.
Oh, I love that. Or imagine Paddington in a big baking competition. He'd be whipping up all sorts of marmalade-infused treats.
Oh, that's perfect. And of course, there would be some kind of mishap in the kitchen. Flour flying everywhere. Maybe he accidentally swaps the sugar for salt.
Oh, classic Paddington. But, at the end of the day, he'd still win everyone over with his charm and good intentions.
Absolutely. He'd probably even end up teaching the judges a thing or two about the power of kindness and, well, the perfect marmalade recipe.
That's Paddington, always spreading joy wherever he goes. And I think that's why we love these stories so much. They remind us that even in a world that can feel a bit chaotic, there's still room for kindness, for innocence, for a little bit of marmalade magic.
Yeah, it's that heartwarming feeling, that sense of hope. Something we could all use a little more of, right?
Definitely. And speaking of heartwarming, Cinema Bites did mention one last thing, a post-credit scene. They wouldn't spill the beans, but they said it's worth sticking around for.
Ooh, a little bonus for the fans. Gotta love that.
So there you have it. We've explored the highs, the lows, the what-ifs of Paddington in Peru. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you a taste of what to expect, maybe sparked some ideas for your own Paddington adventures.
It's always so much fun to chat about these films, unpack the themes, and, just get lost in that Paddington world for a little while.
Absolutely. But now it's your turn. Go see the film, form your own opinions, and most importantly, keep spreading that Paddington spirit of kindness and marmalade-loving adventure wherever you go.
Well said. Until next time, farewell.
Farewell, ACE1.